I am delighted and honored to introduce Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, all the way from California, who is here to join us this evening. When I was looking for different speakers and presenters who could come and share at the intersection of the event that I was hoping to curate and put together, I came up with a short list, and then I shortened the list and I shortened it again. And Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter came right up at the top because I think he represents and can speak to so many of the issues that we've explored today, whether that's about our food systems, whether that's about the agricultural piece, whether it's about bringing our faith into those conversations, or really focusing in on environmental justice and what it means to love our neighbors. And so I am really excited to introduce Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter to you, and also the Reverend Stacy Chavis, who will be entering into conversation with Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter after his presentation to facilitate a time of discussion. And so the way that that's going to work is you can pop all of your questions in the chat as Reverend Dr. Krista Carter is presenting. I'm going to collect all of those in the background, and then I will be feeding them to folks during the discussion time. So be sure to put your questions into the chat, and we'll be glad to hopefully get to as many as we can while we're all here. So Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, his bio reads that he is focused on teaching, research, and activist interests in Black, womanist, and environmental ethics, with a particular focus on race, food, and non-human animals. He is the co-creator of Racial Resilience, an anti-racism and anti-bias program that utilizes combined insights of contemplative practice and critical race theories. His academic publications include Blood in the Soil, The Racial, Racist, and Religious Dimensions of Environmentalism in the Bloomsbury Handbook on Religion and Nature, The Spirit of Soul Food, and Race, Animals, and a New Vision of the Beloved Community in Animals and Religion. Currently, he is an associate professor of theology, race, and ecology at Methodist Theological School of Ohio, a faith and food fellow at Farm Forward, and lead pastor of the Loft at Westwood UMC in Westwood, California. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter to our network today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? I think everybody should be good. All right, awesome. I'm using my cool podcast mic. I got all this. This is the upside of the pandemic is like basically you end up having to buy like studio equipment to preach from home. So I'm definitely enjoying it. Again, I want to thank you all for having me. I especially want to thank Kay for reaching out to me. Um, they had not the easiest time getting hold of me because this summer I happened to be fortunate enough to have a little bit of time off to do some writing. And when I first spoke to them, I was driving. I was actually in an area I grew up in, which is in the tiny town called Three Rivers, Michigan, um, about 5,000 people, and the middle of nowhere. And so I think our phone may have dropped like once or twice because literally it's the middle of nowhere. And I appreciate the perseverance to be able to have this conversation. And I was delighted by the invitation because, as they said, so much of my work sits at the intersection of what not only what y'all are talking about for this conference, but in essence, a lot of the mission of what y'all do. And I'll share a little bit more about that and ultimately about why I do what I do because I think that's so important for us to name and know that. I also want you all to know, I guess, a couple of things. Two things before I start. I am going to share my presentation slides. I will put them in the chat as a PDF when I finish, so that way you all have them in case you want to look at them for notes or something like that. And also the way my lecture is structured, you may ask questions that I probably will answer. Like you may like, oh, what about this? And then like when you get towards the end, I'll be answering them. That's kind of how my brain works. Um, One of the reason that I can have a job where I'm an associate professor of theology, ecology, and race, which to me seems like very three different things, is having ADHD as a neurodivergence gives me the blessing of being able to think intersectionally as default. Um, the downside is that I can't really stop thinking ever. So, but that's another another issue for if you have a conversation on disability and theology, I can talk about that too because I have done a lot of work on that because of trying to understand myself. But I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get to the main stuff. Let me see. There we go. Let me close that and minimize that. So I titled my presentation "Cultivating Hope in a Time of Catastrophe" because while I will share things that aren't exactly happy news, my hope is that by the time we get to the end, when we start talking about being human as praxis, a thinking about what does it mean for us to be in this world as people of faith, and how do we live into our being, um, that I think this is where we get to the hope, right? And I understand hope. I really, even though I'm a Protestant, I'm a virtue ethicist, and so I look to a lot of African centered virtues and Western virtues. And for me, the definition of hope that I've always found um, powerful is from Aquinas, where Saint Thomas Aquinas talks about um, hope being tempered by fear. Hope has this virtue that is tempered by fear. Like hope sits as a virtue in between this kind of passive acceptance that things are going to be the way they are, or this idea that you can't control anything, right? This idea that God is under control and everything's preordained, and this passive kind of benign neglect. Hope is where we understand ourselves as active agents in the world. And it's tempered by fear because the reason we have hope, the reason we cultivate hope is that we can imagine a future that we are afraid of. We can imagine a future that isn't in alignment with our values and what we long for our community, for our families, and for our friends. And because of that fear, we are able to cultivate hope to do the work our soul must have. And for me, this is best explained and best understood in the story of my grandfather as someone who um, just embodies hope, someone who is from Brookhaven, Mississippi, who grew up in a space um, that was Jim Crow America, who lived in a town that was 30 minutes away from where Emmett Till was lynched. 30 minutes today because of highways at the time would have been much farther than that. Um, and this has stayed with him. And despite the struggles and challenges he have, of which I document pretty extensively, well, I shouldn't say that. I document in my book. There are things he did not want me to share, that he's okay with me sharing in forums like this, but he didn't want it in a book, which I totally understand. Um, because of his life and the way in which he continues to inspire me and inspire me as a kid, um, that a big part of me I am because he is, I should say. So most of this lecture is me getting off the top of my head, but there are certain things that I've written because I want to make sure I get the story appropriately. And so I'll be reading this portion before I shift back and forth. When I became an adult, my maternal grandfather, a naturally introverted and quiet man, opened up and began to share stories from his childhood growing up in Brookhaven, Mississippi. Stories of working in the field as a child, of only going to school a few months of the year between the ages of 6 and 10, and becoming a migrant picker when he was 11. As a young adult, he was the lead farmhand of a white farmer, but he had been saving money to buy land to start his own farm. In my grandfather's pithy style, he told me that on the night he told the man he was working for that he was planning on leaving in a few months to start his own farm. The man tried to talk him out of it. And once he realized that he couldn't talk my grandfather out of it, he looked my grandfather dead in the eye and told him that if he wasn't going to work for him, he wouldn't be working for anyone. Knowing a death threat when he heard one, my grandfather ultimately waited a few months and fled to Michigan, where he currently resides. His stories struck something within me, and that is why my academic and activist work centers on religion, ecology, and race, and why I focus so much of my research on agriculture, dehumanization, and class. But in truth, I didn't know the magnitude of my grandfather's influence upon me until I was defending my dissertation. As is common, uh, I was allowed to give the opening remarks for my defense and describe my project to those loving souls who attended. I began my defense by talking about my grandfather, and I started to share how his story shaped my work, and then a very peculiar thing happened. I began to weep. Not cry, I began to weep. Tears welled up in my eyes, and they fell uncontrollably from my face. My advisors, my friends, everyone was taken aback. I'm not, at that point in my life, I should say, I was not what you might call a crier or someone who openly shared emotion. But in that moment, I was struck by the immensity of what I had accomplished, and I was struck by just how far my family had come. Stories of the stories of my people, my ancestors flow through me. And it is the sharing of these stories that has opening me up to a world of ecological knowing that mainstream environmental scholarship tends to overlook. Early on in my academic career, I encountered explicitly or tacitly a Descartesian dualistic view of the human person, an understanding of the self that exists outside of and apart from non human nature. The idea that I think, therefore I am. Again, understanding of the self that's outside of what it means to live in our natural bodies. While this human nature binary existed well before the invention of race, race as a concept made it such that the boundaries between human beings and nature needed to be policed to preserve the hierarchical status of the human, or more precisely, the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able bodied, upper class man. Mainstream environmental scholarship does not explain how the maintenance of this human nature binary is critical for the maintenance of white body supremacy. I use the phrase white body supremacy to draw attention to the ways in which the ideology of white supremacy renders all non white bodies, be they human or other than human animals, as objects. As such, scholars who do not attend to race in their ecological work, all the while arguing for the elimination of the human nature binary and the subsequent oppressive hierarchies that flow from it, fail to understand the depth of the challenge they are undertaking. Asking white people to give up their ideological commitment to the human nature binary is in this way similar to asking white people to give up the idea, the fiction of whiteness. And we all see how that is going. Environmental practices are always racialized, and racializing practices are always environmental. And yet, the majority of white environmental scholars write in such a way that I'm led to believe that they see race as merely one factor among many that ought to be explored when talking about and thinking about the environment. What I want to suggest to you is that one cannot begin to understand ecology or the climate catastrophe we are facing without understanding how racism, colonialism, and imperialism have brought us here. These are the most important topics. I'm sorry, these are the most important points of analysis because the ideology of white supremacy runs deep. As people of faith, we must understand how these concepts inform the very nature of what we think constitutes a human being. As theologian Willie James Jennings notes in his book, The Christian Imagination Theology and the Origin of Race, the idea of whiteness rendered any narrative of the self identity bound to geography, trees, or animals as unintelligible. With the emergence of whiteness, identity was calibrated through the possession of, not possession by, specific land. People would henceforth and forever carry their identities on their bodies without remainder. From the beginning of the colonialist moment, being white placed one at the center of the symbolic and real reordering of space. The idea of race required removing place as the central marker of one's identity and replacing place with the pigmentation of one's skin. One could be French, English, Spanish, or Portuguese, but for the idea of race to stick, the landscapes of someone's white body needed to take precedence over the landscape of their home countries as the primary means of classifying and organizing the human body. By delinking notions of self identity from landscapes and tying them to human bodies, the idea of race should be understood as both a sociocultural and ecological event. Understanding race as a sociocultural and ecological event is important because it helps call attention to the inconsistencies and false equivalencies made by environmentalists and parroted by theologians and activist environmental agencies. And this, I think, should help us understand how we've gotten to our concept of environmentalism today. I define environmentalism as the social movements that seek to protect, preserve, and improve the quality of non-human nature. In this sense, environmentalism is a political and ethical movement grounded in the moral claim that non-human nature deserves consideration when human beings are making decisions that may harm the environment. The way we understand environmentalism as it gets lived out is deeply shaped by inherited narratives, inherited ideologies about what it means to live in a particular place, but also what that landscape should look like and who has access to that particular kind of landscape. In this sense, I argue in my work, this is from a chapter, Blood in the Soil, that the narratives that we use in the way we frame environmentalism have been shaped by what Joe Fegan, sociologist from Texas A&M, describes as the white racial frame, and has led to a kind of environmental othering. Now, othering in this sense refers to the myriad of ways people of color have been denied access to the privileges of environmental, either ownership of land, freedom to choose where one lives, or access to national parks, as we see in this image right here. And people of color disproportionately bear the burdens of pollution and environmental waste. Kimberly Ruffin, in her book, oh, the name just popped out, but it'll pop back in. She only has one book actually about ecology. She's an English professor, interestingly. It's what she calls the ecological burden and beauty paradox. What she talks about is how white people, um, broadly speaking, have this burden. Their burden, if you will, is the belief that we must protect the environment for the sake of leisure or for the sake of it being beautiful. Their understanding of the relationship to nature is one of rest and relaxation. And this is primarily tied to the ways in which working the land often is seen because of the history of the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of blacks as work that they ought not do, as actual labor. And also tied to the way in which we interpret the creation narratives, which I'll share in a moment. Black people and other people of color, however, the burden we carry with respect to environmental othering is that certain activities are understood to be white, and the racialization of any outdoor labor is seen as deeply taking us backwards rather than something that can be proud of. And this encourages reluctance to experience non-human nature as beautiful. Like, it is always a surprise to me when I go camping and hiking how many of my black friends think this is something that white people do, quote unquote, and I have to explain to them the history of this and how framing something like that really lends to the idea that certain activities are just white. But at the same time, I understand how they feel that way because my experience in going to going to like national parks as one of being one, if not one of a handful of black people. Um, Having people stare at me or be surprised at me being by myself or backpacking by myself because of what I look like and how I present to them. I'm not the kind of person they expect to see. And this is often because they think through what I call the white environmentalist frame. This really limits white people's capacity to see people of color as being able to offer critical insight of or to act as necessary contributors to environmental justice. Because many white environmentalists could be considered socially and perhaps politically liberal, the same people would not see their bias as racist. Rather, they would understand them as matters of fact, born out of years of their experience in their environmental movement. Meaning that you just like, hey, this has nothing to do with race. It just is. It's a consequence of all these other kinds of activities. That's a part of the reason why we are in the place that we are in. And I think this leads to the implementation of that first burden that I talked about earlier, um, is that because the way in which white people, broadly speaking, of a certain class, are taught to think of of non-human nature is leisure. It's camping, it's hiking, it's fishing, hunting, even, and it downplays the role of agricultural work and alternative experiences of nature. Right? Agricultural work is we can see by who does agricultural work in this country the ways in which it has been racialized and distributed as a kind of second class labor. Now, what's interesting is when you look at like politically, and we talk about farmers, all we show is white people. We'd be like, oh, it's this person's part, and like, but the fact of the matter is, those may be the people that own the land, but they're the ones who actually grow the food, and often it's corporate farming now, right? We're in a whole different shape of what happens with agriculture, and we can talk about that if someone is interested in learning more about it. This nature as leisure narrative emerges from the retelling of the way we tell pioneer stories. We have often this way of living into a kind of what's how I want to phrase it, of living into this way of remembering that is filled with nostalgia, that tells the stories of the past in a way that doesn't take the reality of their suffering and difficulty as seriously as it is, right? And that, I think, that the kind of way of reading and retelling the past in a way of nostalgia that's not actually history, right? Um, Makes it such that we think about environment, and we can often think about environmentalism, or just way we care about the environment, as something that should be leisurely. And this leads to, I think, part of the challenge we have with respect to why environmentalist organizations tend to be predominantly white, right? Um, and this is something I have experienced multiple times in terms of being recruited or being asked to participate in organizations. Um, and I think rather than asking why don't people of color, or why aren't they more interested in the environment, what I thought it would be helpful to do, and what I would argue people should do, is say, well, what got us here? What happened? And in doing that research, you discovered, you know what, this is kind of the way it was designed. Like Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, these are people who were racist. They talked about eugenics. Um, like the idea of natural parks and conservation was to conserve a particular kind of whiteness, right? Um, Environmental agencies, as such, because they emerged in that period, have been overwhelmingly white, though many claim a desire to be diverse. This has especially happened, and this chapter was published before 2020, but everything ramped up after 2020 with respect to diversity. And uh, my acquaintance, Dorchetta Taylor, has a book that she actually this essay, or I should say this report, she ended up growing into a book, did a survey over um, diversity. And what she found was so fascinating, because she told these people, these organizations, I'm sending you a survey about diversity. Do you want to take it? And they're like, yes, I want to take it. I think in part because these organizations felt like they were more diverse than they were. And what she found out was that most of the organizations stopped filling out the survey at about halfway through, because I think they realized that the answers they were giving weren't going to shed a good light on the organization, meaning that this internalized idea of who they were that was inconsistent with the practical reality of who they were, right? This idea of projecting a certain kind of diversity without recognizing that there's internal work that needs to be done, shifts that need to take place in terms of how you organize and structure yourself and your resources. Necessarily, you're going to change. If you're not willing to change, that's going to be alienating to many people who already don't feel as though they belong, because the organization was designed for them to feel like they don't belong, right? Now, with respect to people of color, there are a lot of narratives that we have inherited, particularly as it relates to Black people. Um, I talk about these narratives at the very beginning of this chapter, and I tell the story about working. My younger brother, who was living with us at the time, was going to a continuation school, which is one of the schools for kids who have a hard time getting through regular high school. And we started a garden club at a school, and my brother was the only boy in the group. And we were trying to recruit other young men to be in the group. And one of them that I could tell was interested, but I was trying to, like, oh, you should do it. You should do it. He was kind of more resistant to it. And then, after like the third or fourth time I asked him, he's like, what are you trying to do? Make me a slave? And what struck me was this kid was 17 years old. He's three generations removed from slavery, I want to be clear. That's really all we are. Maybe he's four. I'm definitely three generations removed from slavery. And yet, that internalized trauma, right? Traumatic retention of slavery has been passed down such that growing food in a garden club triggered that memory. And he was dead serious. And so, to be clear, as I'm saying, I'm not arguing that the narratives of abuse connected to the enslavement of Black bodies in agriculture are used to instill fear of nature or agriculture within the Black community. Rather, I'm arguing that they have been used as a means by which Black people can be aware of the ways in which our labor and our lives can be abused, right? We are attuned to the ways in which we might be abused. And so it triggers something. That retention has been passed on for a particular kind of reason. And also, with respect to like the way we spend time in nature, we have to be mindful and deeply aware of the legacy of lynching and segregation. As I mentioned earlier about my grandfather's story, this is one of the things he just doesn't talk about. He just doesn't talk about. And I didn't really know why. I made an assumption, like most of us might, that he must have saw something or knew of something. And it wasn't until, if you haven't been, I would highly, highly, highly recommend you go to the Legacy Museums in Montgomery, Alabama. It's uh museums founded by, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, names are not working for me right now. Um, the person they made a movie on,
Brian
Brian
Stevenson.
Stevenson. There we go. There we go. Somebody got Brian Stevenson. And I mean, I have a picture with him and everything. Like it just escaped me anyway. Uh, and he talks about the importance of creating these museums to tell a narrative, to make sure that we can actually tell the story of what happened with respect to enslavement of Black people in a way that's accurate and that's historically true. And when I was talking to him, he said the reason he started it was, or among the reasons I shouldn't say the reason, among the reasons why he started it was he feels like that if Brown versus the Board of Education went back to the Supreme Court now, that it wouldn't win. And that should shock us all, should wake us up to the reality of where we are in our country right now, right? That at this time of the court where we have one Black person and actually no, it's all white people, actually it's all white men. Um, that now with the ostensibly more diverse court, we wouldn't be able to pass one of the most important civil rights laws in our country's history. And so I think this museum, for me, gave me an opportunity to learn about where my grandfather was from. There's these steelies that they have that list the people who were lynched in his county. And it gave me pause to realize the kind of terror he grew up around. And in a strange way, I guess it's not strange, it's just a reality. I was very proud because my grandfather is deeply grateful. He talks about part of the reason he's been able to live so long, um, is because he always tries to be grateful for what he has. Not necessarily toxic positivity, but just grateful. And he's always like, things could have been worse when he talks about his childhood. And for me, the only thing that could have been worse for him is to, in my mind, have had something like this happen because he grew up in a way that sounds like it was about a stone's throw from slavery. Um, and so that kind of trauma stays with us and it does get passed down. And I think there's a way in which Christian theology, unfortunately, can exacerbate it. I'm going to say more about this in a little bit, but I want to just at least put this out here now before we move to some deeper theology towards the end of the lecture. I think part of the challenge we have with Christianity and these traumas, especially within, is that um, our understanding of what it means to be human is just deeply flawed, right? It's deeply flawed. We think about being human in a way that's deeply, it's not that the problem for me is not hierarchy, it's that it's an oppressive kind of hierarchy. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. Um, I think the way we interpret the creation narratives have a role to play. And so I'm going to unpack those in a little bit. And I think this way of thinking, this anthropology limits the ability of all created beings to flourish by prioritizing the needs of a particular type of human over against those needs of the rest of creation. So this is what I'm going to get to in a moment when we get to the end. But I just want to explain this is where I think Christianity, particularly Christian theology, is at play. I know all of you are not Christian, but just so you know, this is where I'm thinking about this from, and you have the opportunity to think about from your own particular faith tradition as well. With respect to that way of thinking, it leads to a kind of environmental racism when you're talking about the role race has played in the way we think about environmentalism. So what do I mean by environmental racism? It's when the benefits and burdens of ecological systems are not equitably distributed, or they're not equitably distributed, and they are unjustly distributed along racial lines. And so if you think about, essentially, it's the disproportionate burden that people of color play with respect or experience with respect to environmental um, waste, if you will. And so you have things like environmental job blackmail, meaning that different counties, this is particularly pervasive in Louisiana, where my dad's family's from, um, where these or companies will come into a particular space and say, "Oh, we're going to give you guys these jobs. They're going to pay really well," and to try to persuade people to allow them to build something there. And what happens often is, while there may be a few jobs, they never end up paying as much. Most people who make the good money drive in from other parts of the state and don't actually live there. There's a document by someone named Larry Summers who worked for the World Bank who basically talked about different communities, particularly communities in Africa, as underpolluted. That is a 100% quote, underpolluted. That tells you what he thinks about these particular spaces and who's there. And lastly, you have organizations like Nestle who operate in a kind of corporate racism. If you're not familiar with the baby formula controversy, you can just Google Nestle baby formula racism and you can learn more about it. But essentially, they were selling formula or giving formula away to poor communities in Africa, different countries in Africa, even though they knew that they didn't have clean water to mix the formula with, and so these kids were going to get sick. But they were like, "Hey, this is the they're like we're giving women these choices so they can go to work. This is particularly terrible." Um, it also exists with respect to displacement of goods, right? So you think about something like food apartheid, and this is a word that I and other activists and scholars use rather than food deserts, because a desert is a naturally occurring phenomenon, whereas an apartheid is explicitly tied to the political actions of a government. And so, because of the legacy of segregation in our country, this is how we experience food apartheid, right? Different communities have access to different kinds of goods, and other communities are marginalized because of the makeup of that community. And this has led to a particular kind of food insufficiency and insecurity. Um, and most of those people are poor and people of color, right? And I would say, lastly, with respect to food insecurity, this is where I would say my work is deeply interracial, is because, as I was talking about the town I came from, I grew up in a pretty rural town. Um, and there's a lot of poor people, and they're not just black, right? There is a way in which rural communities are deeply exploited, so deeply exploited. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to persuade these communities. I think so much can be done to persuade these communities with respect to their political actions, but also their theologies. Once you're able to, as Martin Luther King would put it, help them realize that the lies they've been told that's feeding them is Jim Crow, and that ultimately is empty calories, right? They just fed them Jim Crow when they were hungry, is what King would say, rather than actually feeding them the nurturing word of justice and love and compassion, right? And so this is how I understand structural racism to work. And I'm going to show this before I talk a little bit about how structural racism works in the food system, and then I'll talk more about like what we can do to begin to change stuff. So I understand structural racism to be operating in these three spheres, right? So when we're talking about environmental racism, it operates within this kind of structure: economics, politics, and ideas. And I'm really talking about an unequitable distribution, essentially, right? So economically, we're talking about racism. We're talking about how there's inequalities that can be traced along racial lines, resource inequalities, political inequalities, and ideas and ideologies that normalize this distribution, right? To make us believe that these people are getting what they quote unquote deserve. So what does this look like? If you talk about history of enslavement, basically, economically, this really deeply impacted Black people because generational wealth was created that we didn't have access to, even though we were responsible for helping to create it, right? Politically, this created a space of hegemonic political power for mostly white men. And ideologically, we know that enslavement was normalized because BIPOC people, right, black, indigenous, and other people of color were racialized as less intelligent, and ultimately less human theologically than white people. With respect to contemporary farming, we understand that Black farmers have been denied funding or given higher interest rates or poor loan terms with respect to actually having their own land. politically, what this creates is a loss of political power, even in black communities, because white people own the land, and home ownership and investment in the land is deeply tied to political activism and engagement. Ideologically, I believe it comes from this idea that black people, especially, were meant to till the land and not own the land, right? This is still the ways in which it fits in the broader ideologies of black people not being as intelligent. With respect to food access, we can think about the fact that a lot of people have this assumption that black people are not healthy and won't eat healthy food because it is quote unquote in their culture, right? These are these ideas. I mean, just look at who is in commercials and what that commercial is advertising, right? Pay particular attention to that, and you see how these ideologies are manifest. This incentivizes not creating the kind of infrastructure we need in black communities because it seems like it's a bad investment. Therefore, the food that's in these communities is more expensive. Lastly, this is allowed to happen because this thing called deed restrictions. What deed restrictions are is that if a grocery store moves into a community and they end up realizing for whatever reason they don't want to be there anymore, perhaps it's economic reasons or whatever, they created a this restriction so that another grocery store can't replace that one that just left for another like maybe 5 to 10 years. Um, and so basically, it creates again food apartheid, and there's no political pressure to solve that problem. You have to be deeply active within your state legislature often to address this issue. So what do we do? What do we do with all this stuff that I just said? Like, let me get towards the end so we can wrap up. Ultimately, my solution is that we need to redefine what it means to be human as people of faith. And I'm going to talk about this with respect of Christianity, but I would argue that this way of thinking about what it means to be human fits in a broader scope of what we would call ontology, right? What it means to be and exist in that kind of way. Um, my argument within my work, particularly my book, The Spirit of Soul Food, is that since the onset of coloniality, which means just colonialism, this is so you're talking about 1500s, broadly speaking, the human has become a projection of what Emily Towns called the fantastic white hegemonic imagination, essentially meant rendering human virtually synonymous with white men, right? Meaning that often we mean human beings or human, we are often talking about white men. Now, to be clear, this is deeply practical and relevant right now. Just if you think about just man, the way we think about human, and we think about and talk about the ways in which women's medical, how medicine marginalizes women just because because they're not men. There's so much disenfranchisement along gender lines as well, and I'm talking about that a little bit. But I want to be clear that while race is a deep part of this, patriarchy is a very profound strain in this as well. That we're always disentangling and unpacking, which is primary reason why, as you probably have noticed, most of the people that I cite and source as we get through the rest of this is all women of color. Um, my argument is that decolonizing Western Christianity's assumptions about the human requires viewing being human as praxis, or a process of learning, unlearning, and applying and realizing our humanness in anti-oppressive ways. I love the language of anti-oppression rather than liberation because I think anti-oppression makes explicit what it is we're trying to do, and we can constantly ask ourselves, how and in what ways are we living and acting in ways that are enabling oppression, right? And so we want to live in an anti-oppressive framework. I believe again we've adopted a kind of anthropology that stems from colonialism with how we understand ourselves to be human. Essentially, there's no coincidence that this happened during chattel slavery because those who understood themselves to be white, who racialized themselves to be white, had to think of reasons and create an identity that could justify and de-link them from their own humanness so they could exploit people in a way that didn't make them feel like they were doing anything wrong, right? And this constitutes this kind of historical amnesia by the way they tell history, this idea that individualism, this instantaneous fulfillment of desires. I should have what I want, and that matters rather than to broadly speak in the community. And the idea that we're number one mythology, this idea that we are the chosen one, the chosen people, and that kind of mythology deeply shapes how we understand ourselves and what it means, how we connect with God. By theological anthropology, what I'm meaning is the human human, human non-human nature, and human God relationship, right? Fundamentally, what it means to be human. How do we understand ourselves as human beings in relationship with these other aspects that I just described? A challenge we have within this country, especially, is the idea of social Darwinism. Deeply shapes our understanding of what it means to be human and how certain humans suffer while other ones don't. This idea of survival of the fittest, right? Which is not Darwin, but is the people who created social Darwinism. So Darwin um, was practically a vegan, deeply was pacifist. Like he's just a different kind of cat that people don't. If you read Descent of Man, you'll be like, oh, Darwin thought pretty differently. Um, so anyway, social Darwinism made the argument that certain groups were just socially unfit, and it was up to white people to help them understand what it meant to be human. What I argue is that liberation theologians and other non-white Christians, they've critiqued the racism that is present in our contemporary anthropologies, but we have not sufficiently decolonized modern definitions of the human. Ultimately, we have argued that we are human too as a response to our dehumanization. But I argue that by being just as human as white people, it does little to deconstruct the racism, sexism, and ecological extractivist thinking that normalizes oppression. Ultimately, American Christians especially are implicitly taught and socialized to accept an anthropocentric structure of Christianity that places humans as the pinnacle of creation. Racial formation ensures that the human is understood to be white. Patriarchy ensures that he is male. Heterosexism and ableism ensures that he is able bodied and straight. When people of color and women strive to be full human beings within this flawed structure, we are striving toward an anti Christian theological principle that replicates an oppressive hierarchical model that places whiteness, maleness, able bodiedness, and heterosexism as the pinnacles of creation. So, I would argue, unless we attend to this anthropology, the majority of Christians, right, women, people of color, disabled people, and especially Black Christians, are at risk of subscribing to theological norms that have normalized our exploitation and the exploitation of non-human nature. So this is the decolonial theological anthropology I'll go through, and I'll go through fairly quickly because I'm already 5 minutes over. So I won't go too fast, but I won't linger. At its most basic level, to decolonize and understand, to decolonize our understanding of what it means to be human, I believe we should describe who we're called to be, how we're called to live, and what we're called to do. And so for me, who we're called to be is deeply rooted in self-love. How we're called to live is connected to solidarity, and what we're called to do is holistic interdependence. And I draw on different religious traditions, but particularly Christianity, to get these three norms, or these three practices, I should say. But the norm that makes this theological anthropology decolonial is that all creation has sacred worth, and no created being should be exploited in the eyes of God. Fundamentally, that's it. So that's my starting principle. That's my starting framework. If everything is sacred, and when you start there, it changes how you interact with everything because you understand everything to have sacred worth. You understand that it's not yours. You don't own something. How can you love something with this idea of and delinking yourself from the idea of owning it, right? It shapes and changes the way in which you interact with that thing because a part of what it means to love something is to allow it to be its best self. This norm for me is shaped by my reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so for Jesus in the Gospels, he understands sin as a failure to bother to love. And so for me, a part of what it means to live into this norm is to recognize the ways in which within our traditions we sin because we fail to bother to love. So often we have these ideas and notions of sin that are rooted in like following these kind of commandments or this list of rules. But what we see with Jesus, sin is more often mentioned in the way in which we falter on our relational responsibilities with someone, when we fail to live up to the gifts that we have, right? To engage and act and to do something to mediate someone's suffering or to just be present. Failing to bother to love, I would argue, is a consequence of a kind of selfishness that is at the root of our ecological crisis. So we have to we have to decolonize and retell these narratives, particularly our creation narratives and the narrative of what it means to be human in ways that lead to full flourishing. So with respect to creation narratives, part of the reason I use this is within my own community, scripture plays a vital role. Like if I didn't want to actually like use the Bible, people wouldn't really, they'd be like, well, I don't know what you're talking. Like that matters, right? These verses carry hundreds of years of misinterpretation need to be corrected. And a decolonial reading of these narratives decenters our notion of the human from white body supremacy and allows us to reinterpret them in ways that center interdependence between all created life. With respect to the narratives, I think the couple of things I'll say before I move on is recognizing that they're both poetry. This is stuff some of you probably already know. And this allows for reimagination, reinterpretation because good poetry has a surplus of meaning. recognizing that the way we translate dominion is much more about relationality and responsibility at best. It's about the responsibilities we have to non-human nature. And so I think mastery is actually a helpful way to think about it in terms of a practice. Like do we like how you master a sport or a chess or something like that. It's a particular kind of responsibility given to humans to use our power in over non-human nature in ways that actually are in alignment not only with God, who actually is responsible for it all, but in alignment with the way in which we have to help all of us to survive and flourish. And by all of us, I mean all of non-human nature. Within a second narrative, I think it's easier to find the agricultural ways in which we might look at this and build from it. To talk about tilling and keeping the land. Um, I think till and tend is a very helpful way to think about it as opposed to keep. Like, what does that mean to actually tend something? And when you read with both verb meanings in mind, we can read the text as stating that a distinctive part of the human vocation of caring for the earth is to both keep and serve the garden, to learn from it while respecting its limitations. And I think the limitations part is where we fall short because more often than not, when you're talking about the idea of selfishness, as we mentioned earlier with respect to sin, selfishness often wants a limitless freedom, right? It wants this limitless freedom, freedom to do whatever it is, without the kind of mutual accountability that is deeply embedded in these narratives, right? Limitless freedom is what these narratives are critiquing against, right? And I think that's a key interpretive lens that we often don't tend to. So, self love, what does this mean? This is really for people of color. Embracing self love is crucial because it allows us to heal from the residue of colonialism. Seeing ourselves as created in the image of God, seeing ourselves as worthy of love, despite the ways in which society may tell us we are not lovable, is profoundly healing. Embracing the divine command to love ourselves is what I believe can allow people of color to begin to do the work of ecological stewardship because it starts with the self. It starts seeing yourself as a part of nature in a way that doesn't connect you to the animalization we have experienced. Solidarity, in this sense, aims to foster right relationships with other created beings in the land that mirror the life teachings of Jesus, right? Jesus fostered interdependent relationships with the people who would otherwise be outcasts. Um, and so we don't want to be following white European Jesus, right? We're talking about Palestinian Jesus, right? Palestinian Jew. And this is again a part of the decolonization process, realizing that this rendering of a first century Palestinian Jew is much more representative of who Jesus was. How might Christianity change fundamentally in terms of how we think about each other and who we worship if we replaced images of Jesus that are in churches from this picture that you see on the right to the one on the left? How might that shift the way we think about what it means to be human and who we need to be in solidarity with, right? I argue that this solidarity extends to non human animals and non human nature as well when the harm is unnecessary for our survival. And I believe you can pull this from scripture. For white folks, it's different, right? For white people of faith, but I think with respect to this, I'm talking about Christianity. We have to, you need to embrace the implications of self love in a way that requires you to empty oneself, I think, of the colonial assumptions that frame your self understanding. Meaning you have to discover what it means like to love yourself outside of the idea of whiteness. Who are you when that is removed? How are you connected to the land that can give you an identity? How might your landscape of who you are be rooted in place rather than your enfleshment, right? Rather than the ways in which the landscape of your body. That is the growth and the challenge that we actually have to cultivate within those kinds of communities to understand who you are in a way that can lead to healing of yourself and mending right relationships with others. Emptying yourself of the idea of hierarchical supremacy takes work and requires being in solidarity. This means decentering white experiences as the truth and centering BIPOC social and theological reflections. At its best, this leads to a renewal and reconciliation of relationships between white people and those whom they or their ancestors have harmed. Secondly, solidarity requires anamnesis, the intentional remembering of the exploited, marginalized, and minoritized victims of their historical and ancestral legacy of oppression. Ultimately, I'm arguing that, white people are not at fault for their mistakes, misdeeds, or evil actions of their ancestors, but they do have a responsibility of reconciliation. right? That is what has been inherited. And it's our responsibility, all of us, to heal from these wounds. And it's our inability to actually acknowledge the truth of what happened is what has continued to prevent us from healing. We are living in the political moments of this wound now. And so we have the chance to do something about it. This is not easy. And I would suggest that what needs to happen often is people of faith, particularly white people, have to take what I will call a U turn, right? When it feels difficult to do this, when it feels challenging to do this, to turn inward and ask yourself why you feel this way rather than blaming someone else for talking about topics that you may find difficult. Attend to the feelings, hold them in compassionate care. Within each one of those reactivities that tell you you don't need to be in solidarity with people of color, there is within it a kernel of wisdom that can be potentially liberative for you. They can serve as guideposts to help you decolonize your minds and help you identify the assumptions that reinforce the logic of coloniality. That part of you is trying to tell you something, trying to get at something within you that feels like it has not been met intended to. Compassion, I would argue, with yourself can give you the framework to do that healing. Lastly, holistic interdependence, accepting that we are all created in the image of God and that we are called to imitate the solidaristic love practice of Jesus. This allows the spirit of liberation to work within, persuade, and inspire Christians in and in how we carry out the mission of God's to care for the earth. This way of thinking is not egalitarian, but anthropocentric through the lens of black and indigenous spiritualities, meaning that there's a way to view non-human nature as a part of our notion of community, right? And I think this, for me, the idea of community is key. It is critical for us to understand the responsible relationships we have with each other. That is the end. I apologize that I went over. I didn't. I looked at it and I was like, oh, I'm gonna end up going over because I put too much in there, which is unsurprising given my neurotypicalness or not. So hopefully it wasn't too much. And thank you for people putting Brian Stevenson in the chat and somebody shouting it out. That's like I truly appreciate it. Yeah, thank you all for listening. And I think right now we're gonna move to discussion and then questions. But Kay, do you want to say
Yes.
something before we do that, or whoever? Yeah.
Actually, I think I'm going to jump right in and give Katie a chance to rest their voice. First, thank you on behalf of Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light for bringing this very topical, very relevant, not just to this convening, but to our work, to this country, and how we are trying to live and express ourselves in evolving intersectionalities and understanding of intersectionalities. I want to, as an eco womanist, it took me all I can not to open up the mic and go preach, Pastor, several times. So I thank you for what you bring to the table. I'm wondering, I do have a couple questions, and then if any are put in the chat, Katie will forward those to me. When we talk about where you said organizations no, your friends survey, they stopped doing it. The organizations ultimately know work must be done. When we talk about emptying of self for our melanin challenged friends who want to learn a new way forward. We talk about solidarity and we talk about U turns. Can you provide for those who might not be fully entrenched in the mechanisms of womanism or eco womanism, how that lens could be helpful in understanding what we have to do together and that we're all interrelated?
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a great question. And honestly, if we had been not virtually, but in the same place, you could have been saying anything you and it'd have been fine because he just been call and response, and I'd have went right with you. It would have worked. Um, I think that for me, I use several eco womanist resources in scholarship, but for me, the one that I'm most in conversation with, and that's because it's my friend is Melanie Harris. Like a part of the reason I even so some of you may or may not know Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris was the first woman to earn full professor at in religion at a I think at not a seminary or something like she just super duper amazing. She's at
Yeah.
Wake Forest now, um, and she gave me the permission I needed to do this work because to be a black person, they'd be like, I'm really interested in nature and animals and food. When all the other black people in seminary are getting PhDs are like really specifically focused on like topics that feel more relevant, right, with
Mhm.
respect to what it means to be Black.
Mm.
She really was like, this is what you want to do, and this is important. And the reason, and I said, I share that to say what she told me, I think, is what she does in her work and how I think womanism is helpful, eco womanism especially. It's about narratives and story. And
Yeah.
she talks so much about her own story and how her story and her narrative, like her experience, shaped her and her relationship with non-human nature. And I think what I would encourage organizations to do, especially if you're just beginning to do this work, or even if you've been doing it for a while and you haven't found it successful, like hopefully you have some relationships of people you can talk to that you can go and not ask, oh, what do you think I should do? Go ask them, well, why do you do this work? And
Mm.
how can I help you do what
Yeah.
you're doing better? And listen to their story, right? Listen to their story. It's their story that informs their theology. It's their story that informs the practice that they do. And
Mhm.
and it is that within eco womanists, they talk about the way we have to retell stories in a way that doesn't center the experience of predominantly white people. And so what I've had to do in my book and some other narratives is, or other articles I should say, is you have stories like my grandfather's, and when I tell it from his particular perspective, without centering all the other stuff like that happened to him, but rather him as the moral agent and taking control and ownership over his life, it helps us, it shifts our perspective. And it can allow, I would argue, people to see the agency and self determination, the commitment that he had, and the fact, and I didn't mention this in the talk, that he still, up until until 10 years ago, he owned land that he still farmed. Like
Mm.
he loved farming. He loved that work. He loved the way in which that connected him to the land. And for him, it was telling stories about how he grew up that shaped him, that have shaped me into this work. And so I would argue that one of the things that you can learn from eco-womanism is the importance of storytelling and just listening. Not trying to fix, not trying to say do that, not trying to tell you do it like this. Just listen and see what comes up and support. Because the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, Stacy, because
You're
this just
fine.
popped
You're
in my
fine.
head. One of the things that I think happens is I've heard in this, like people say, "Oh, I want why isn't my organization more diverse?" And I'm doing all this work to make it diverse. Well, one thing you can do is if you like show up and if you want more black people or people of color to be in your organization, then you need to actually show them that you care by showing up and helping them in things that have nothing to do with your organization, right? But the things that they actually care about. You got to be present. You
Amen.
got to show up. And if you do
Amen.
that and create those relationships, right, that's going to matter. Like if you want them to care about your thing, then you got to care about their thing. Like that's just mutual.
Yes, thank you. I have another question. I heard eco womanism. I also heard eco theology, and I understand the need to demystify, decolonize stewardship so that we understand. And we are obviously two Christian pastors talking, and how we are understanding that if the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, it does mean non-human animals. It means we are not over creation, but in creation. We are creation and of creation. And I wonder from an interfaith perspective, how we might go about ensuring that we can motivate, encourage people who maybe through no theological or religious understanding still think they are here to dominate the earth. What in your work have you found to be touchstones for people who are both theologically based and grounded, even though that needs adjustment, correction, pivoting, and then those who are not?
You know, it's interesting because I have two answers that I want to give. And the first is companion animals, interestingly, has been one of the ways in which I get at it, which is was surprising to me, and I'll share more about that in a moment. Um, but the other way that I think really helps in terms of talking about our interconnectedness, I think Howard Thurman, who is a Christian but a contemplative and mystic, talks about this idea of oneness
Yeah.
that I find really alluring and appealing that's been helpful for me that I reference a lot. And he talks about it within a framework of what he calls the sound of the genuine. And you may have heard this
Yes.
before. Yeah. And like the time, if you've not heard Thurman talk about the sound of the genuine, there's a commencement speeches and it's a part of much of what he talked about. But what he gets at in this is he recognizes that fundamentally within all of us, there is this. what I would call this compassionate core, this way of being in the world that is deeply us. And that all too
Mhm.
often we are so distracted by everything that's happening in our contemporary society that doesn't allow us to hear that
Mm.
sound, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
the challenge he has to us is, can we, he says, not only can we quiet ourselves, can we still ourselves to listen to that sound of the genuine within us, right? To actually hear
Yeah.
who we are as a person without the need to compete with someone, without the need to be someone that we're not and perform, but the essence of who we are. And then he says, when you can do that,
You
in
can do
doing that
that.
work and
Yeah.
discovering, I would argue, what it is who you want to be rather than what you want to do with your life. It allows you, when you hear the sound of your own genuine, to be able to listen and hear the sound of the genuine in others. It
Right.
fundamentally or reorients you to listen for others and their genuineness, right? And so that the
Right.
conversations you then have really can just be like orchestra music, like it's choral music, like it is you're making these sounds are coming together in a way that's beautiful. Now
Yeah.
that's one. I said the interesting thing I would tell you about non-human animals as the other way or companion animals is because um, my wife is the smart one in the marriage. Actually, my wife is a veterinary oncologist. So she's always I've known my wife. I'm in one of those very traditional Midwestern marriages where I got married when I was 22, and my wife and I have been friends since she was 14. So we've been together for. And I actually shaved and trimmed up all the gray, so you can't quite tell how old I am. Let's just I'm older than I probably look. We were together for a long time, and in her work, what I've realized is that it's in those moments when people's attachment to their companion animal is tested because they're dying. Because ultimately, what she is a chaplain. That
Uh,
is the moment where they realize the interconnectedness of life. Because what we're
mm.
arguing for is this expansion of community, right?
Yes.
This
Right.
idea that community is beyond the way in which we've limited it with respect to our families or our friends or our own religious traditions or whatever. And
Yeah.
so what she's able to help people do, and what I've seen in her work and my conversations with her and now others, is seeing the way non-human animals allows us to create a notion of community that is fundamentally expansive. And so then I use that as an invitation, right, for people to consider what it means, right, to see other life as having value now that you've experienced a loss of something that probably surprised you in a way. It's deeply transformative, loss. Well, this is what I guess Richard Rohr, another mystic, um, he calls
Yes.
this necessary suffering.
Mm.
And I don't know if I will. I think you could say I don't know if I would say necessary suffering as much as you want to perhaps call it like natural suffering. That we're all going to
Inevitable.
experience death.
Yeah.
But what do
Yeah.
we do with that? What do we do with loss? And how do we use that in a way to draw us closer to the things that matter, right, in our
Right.
lives?
Right. A question from the chat. Would you say that is gentrification another form of colonization?
Oh man. I mean, it is, but I think the hard part. So I say that, and I say it in a way my face is, oh man, is I haven't written about gentrification because I'm really trying to find. I'm not the kind of person who wants to talk about something unless I can actually have solutions. And the
Mm.
underlying issue with gentrification, I would argue, in this country is a housing shortage that's deeply tied to other broader political
Right.
things. I live in LA. We have no housing. And so it is overly expensive. Everything is very expensive. Even
Right.
stuff that people shouldn't be living in costs too much money. And
Hmm.
so people are encroaching on other spaces that historically have been for people of color, other poor people. But a part of me is like, they don't have anywhere. Where are they gonna go? Like, and then another part of me is like, well, then the other people, where are they gonna go? So I'm trying to. I believe two things can be true, right? I believe two things can be true. Yes, that's true, but also the underlying issue actually is building up communities in a way that actually gives them the capacity and tools to maintain um what they to maintain the identity of that community, while also inviting guests, if you will, to come in and not take over ownership of that space, right? This
Understood.
work that can be done, but it has to be done so intentionally.
Yeah.
um and we struggle with this because of the history of segregation,
Hmm.
right? Like we
Hmm.
really, I don't like, so again, I mentioned my family's from the South, like Mississippi and Louisiana. When I go, my dad's family's from Hammond, Louisiana. And in Hammond, Like like the phrase the other side of the tracks is like literally where the black people live. It's like on you cross the railroad tracks,
Right.
it's the other side of the tracks. And it's like
Right.
it's different. It's like going to a different town. And so um like we're still dealing with the residue of that. And
Mm,
trying to repair that requires an honest assessment of what the historical wrongs. And we don't in America, we just don't like talking about like I said, we have historical amnesia. We don't want to admit, we don't want to be accountable for the things we've done wrong. And what I want to tell you, for all of you who are non-white in this space, please know I do not expect you to not do something racist as a person of color. But I know we live in a world that teaches all of us that racism is normal. What I want you to do, and what my hope and my prayer for you is to be accountable when you do something and to learn from it and grow, to see that as an opportunity for liberation rather than shame, because you probably maybe did something that maybe you've done in the past multiple times, but now something clicked and you know it's wrong or you know it's not right and you don't want to do it anymore. That's great. That's a good thing, right? Celebrate that, even though it hurts in the moment. And that for me is that's what I want.
amen. That's very great. I'm grateful for that, but and I'm grateful for how graceful and grace filled that is. There's a follow up question, and we're almost at our end of our time. Do you think that a community garden could reorient a primarily I'm sorry. How can a community garden reorient a primarily gentrified space?
I want to point you off. You're not. I wish I might have time to look some stuff, and maybe I'll just send it to Kay. If you're not familiar with what's happened in Detroit, so I know more what's happened in Michigan because I keep up with um, several scholars actually work at the University of Michigan. That's where Dorchetta used to work. And Detroit is a prime example of using community gardens to reorient gentrified space. Because what happened as a consequence, so I didn't really want to move to California. Um, I like, I like living in the Midwest. It's slower, it's greener, air is cleaner, you know? Um, but I had a good scholarship and we knew we needed to move because right before in 2007, if you remember, the economy was collapsing. Jobs were just gone. Like it's a very agricultural or industrial state. And that was a huge part of the reason why I left. And so Detroit basically went to bankruptcy, for those of you who don't know. And because of that, property values just plummeted. They were still taxing people over things that for a property value that wasn't actually accurate for what it reflected. So a lot of people of color lost their homes in these traditionally what I want to say, like neighborhoods that would normally be preserved for this, like in preservation societies, if you will. And so what's happened is speculators came in and bought up some of that property, which was unfortunate. But they didn't move into them, and so people like reclaimed the adjacent lots and things like that around those properties to build community gardens. And because they've been actively taking care of those resources and those lands, there's been legislation and other kinds of activist work that's been passed that has allowed them to purchase at the actual cost rather than the inflated value that the speculators are trying to sell it at this land and these houses back. And it started because people from within those communities started caring for that land by growing food on it
Right.
and giving it away. Right, that was the first action that they did to begin to recapture and reclaim space that was theirs. It is powerful, the work that's happening in Detroit, and I know it's probably modeled in other places, but that's one that comes up for me because it is close to my heart.
I have one question before I turn it back over to Kate for those who are able to remain with us. Given the state of the Anthropocene, and I also recommend your participation in the lecture from a few years ago, what are three avenues of hope for us as we do this climate work and all of our intersectionalities?
I would say one area of awareness that I think leads to hope is recognizing that the Anthropocene is when we use the Anthropocene. I gestured towards this, but I didn't have because I already went. I know I was going to go over time when I was finishing and put my policy judges on it. I use that term, and I think we need to be specific about who we're talking about. Broadly speaking, we're not talking about all
Mm,
humanity that's contributing equally, right? There's certain humans that are
yeah,
contributing more. People in the West are contributing more. Broadly speaking, white people are contributing more. So we need to be very specific. But in truth, the people who are the primary contributors are corporations. And so for
yeah.
me, the hope that we have to have is
Mm.
to actually have this is where local politics matters. This is where we made the most change in Louisiana with respect to the um uh the pollution that's happening. Well, I mean, we were making stuff, and the new governor is just a crazy person, but um like local politics matters, and this is what they set the standards for the amount of pollution that these communities can actually have and that can maintain. And so I think the top one, I think it's 100 corporations contribute 80% of the carbon emissions. And so we have to recognize like this is a corporate problem, right? So I think one area of hope is to not, I would say, not try to blame others to be like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do that to like to make the to to shift things so we don't actually have the climate catastrophe that I think we all want to avoid. We need to do individual things. So the next two things are going to be individual, but the primary thing is actually begin to address a corporate greed and corporate exploitation over the environment. I think that's deeply important. That's the first thing. The second thing I would tell people to do is, and this is my bias, I'm being honest with you because I'm a vegan, is I'm going to tell you to eat less meat. like like I'm going to tell you like this is one of the things I think you need to do because it really does contribute to uh ecological carbons, but for me, to be honest, the primary reason I became a vegan has literally it was connected to the ecology, but broadly speaking is because the people who work in those fields and those lands are people of color, and I didn't want to be complicit in exploitation. I
Amen.
always say my veganism is rooted by my commitment to my people. Not, I love the animals, but that's not in nature. But
Mhm.
I don't want to be complicit in exploitation. And so I think one area of hope for us is to me this changes the dynamic we have in terms of how we relate to non-human nature, right? By not eating animals. And the third avenue I would say, and where I think we can find hope, is with our kids. And so if you have children or grandchildren or nephews or nieces or whatever, these are the kind of conversations you have to have with them. But you'd be shocked. Many of you might not be shocked, but I was shocked when I was teaching how aware these young people are about what it is they need to change, how they understand it's a political issue that they have to be active in, and how they are committed to being politically active about ecology at the local and state level. I would say what I'm experiencing a lot in California. That gives me tremendous hope, right? That as they get older and they get to vote, that they're thinking about the solidarity rather than just their individual kind of self. And I taught for years at the University of San Diego, which is a Roman Catholic institution that's predominantly white and wealthy. And these kids were still thinking this way. And so I said that to say, like, there is space for hope. I think the majority of people that are, at least in my experience, majority of young people fundamentally understand this is something they are committed to shifting and changing and addressing. And that gives me hope. That gives me a lot of hope. Stacy, thank you so much for the great questions before I get to say anything, because those were amazing. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you and bless you. And Kay, thank you.
Wow, thank you both. I feel like we've covered so much ground today. For those of you who've been here with us since 1 o'clock, from our opening keynote with Leah Penniman, where we talked about land sovereignty and we talked about the Black experience in America around land ownership, and then emerging down our two different tracks where all of us were sharing in space together, whether we're a little bit more policy geeky and like to talk through the details of what it looks like to put pressure in that system, or whether we're really committed to being in the dirt. I know that the session that I led, where we were exploring imaginations, certainly left me with a lot to ponder and think about. And so then to come into this final shared space together, and Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, just the way that you walked us through that, there is so much there that I'm going to need to sit and take in, to really just continue to process that and what my own role is, and how us as a network can continue to live into this liberation that you've so graciously handed to us and asked us to consider. So thank you, for leading us in that work, and then Reverend Stacy for just holding space for questions in that way. So I am feeling an immense amount of gratitude for each of you, and also for giving us a couple extra minutes of your time. So if you do need to head out, Please make sure you take a little feedback survey. It really helps us to know where we're doing well, where you found resonance. It really helps us as we continue to plan future programs. If you also want to share publicly in the chat how you're feeling, maybe a couple of words about what you're walking away with from your time today, feel free to do that. If you are excited to stay on for a little bit longer for a chat, we do have breakout rooms that are open for both East PA, Southwest PA, and South Central PA, and then everybody else, you're with me if you'd like to hang out for a little bit longer. But if not, this does bring our formal kind of programming to a close for this evening and for this year's convening. So make sure that you stay tuned. We've got plenty more programs like this, and we really want to continue building something special together here. Thank you for your time and your attention, for the ways that you are helping us build and imagine and seed new futures. So thank you.